I watched our lines fall back while my estimates were corrected to fit the orders. On quiet roads, I saw trucks pause and vanish again, and my superiors waited for a shortage that never came. Each report I filed grew smaller as the system held to what it already believed. I kept marking the map, knowing the cost would arrive before permission did. In early August 1944, the Western Front in France had entered a phase of rapid movement unlike anything German headquarters had planned for in the years before the invasion. Following the Allied breakout from Normandy after Operation Cobra, German forces in northern France were no longer engaged in static defense, but in a series of withdrawals, counterattacks, and improvised holding actions. The front line no longer held a continuous shape. Instead, it bent and shifted daily as divisions attempted to regroup under constant pressure from Allied air power and ground advances. At that time, Major Karl-Heinz Bremer served on the staff of a German army corps operating east of Avranches, along the routes leading toward the Seine. Bremer was not a frontline commander. His responsibility lay in operational logistics and movement analysis, tracking enemy transport capabilities, estimating supply throughput, and advising superiors on how long Allied units could sustain forward momentum. His work was conducted from requisitioned farmhouses and small town offices, using maps spread across wooden tables, with radio reports arriving intermittently as units fell back or lost contact. Bremer's position required long hours of routine observation rather than dramatic decision-making. Each morning began with reviewing aerial reconnaissance summaries, intercepted radio traffic, and field reports from German units that had managed to disengage overnight. Much of the information was fragmentary. Roads marked on maps no longer existed in usable form. Bridges reported destroyed one day were sometimes crossed by Allied vehicles the next. Yet the task remained the same: estimate what the enemy could move, how fast, and with what limitations. German doctrine at the time still assumed that large-scale mechanized movement required railheads, fixed depots, and carefully prepared road networks. Fuel shortages, in particular, were believed to impose strict ceilings on operational reach. These assumptions had shaped planning throughout the war, especially on the Eastern Front. Bremer had been trained within this framework and had applied it without question in earlier campaigns. The situation in Normandy initially appeared to confirm these beliefs. Allied progress after the landings had been slow and costly. Reports through June and early July emphasized congestion at the beaches, damaged ports, and narrow supply corridors. German estimates suggested that once the Allies broke out, they would still face logistical pauses, giving German forces time to establish defensive lines deeper in France. By late July, however, Bremer began to notice discrepancies between expectation and observation. Allied armored columns were reported in locations sooner than projected. Units thought to be stalled for fuel were reappearing farther east within 24 hours. When German reconnaissance aircraft managed to fly, they observed road traffic patterns that did not match established models. On 6 August, Bremer received a routine field report from a security battalion operating near a secondary road junction west of Le Mans. The report noted significant motor transport activity overnight. The language was unremarkable and similar to dozens of others crossing his desk each week. Yet attached to it was a simple sketch drawn by an officer in the field, showing the position of an American truck parked along a hedgerow, engine off, no visible escort. Bremer initially treated the report as incidental. Single vehicles were often separated from columns. However, the accompanying time notation caught his attention. The truck had been observed in the same general location during 3 separate patrols over a 12-hour period, each time joined by different vehicles, stopping briefly before continuing east. Bremer cross-referenced the location with his movement maps. The road was not designated as a primary supply route. It bypassed major towns and had not appeared in earlier traffic density estimates. According to German planning assumptions, such a road should have seen limited use, especially for sustained movement. Later that afternoon, an aerial reconnaissance summary arrived noting increased Allied traffic along several minor routes in the same region. The report lacked detail, cloud cover had been heavy, but it confirmed activity where little was expected. Bremer marked the areas lightly in pencil, intending to revisit the matter once more data arrived. Over the next 2 days, similar reports accumulated. None described large convoys or dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, they noted continuous movement, small groups of trucks, jeeps, fuel tankers, and maintenance vehicles traveling day and night. Traffic control points appeared to be temporary and mobile. Vehicles paused briefly, then dispersed. Bremer compared these observations against German estimates of Allied transport capacity. The numbers did not align. Even allowing for captured fuel and improvised depots, the volume of movement suggested a system operating beyond the limits defined in pre-war manuals. The discrepancy was not yet alarming, but it was persistent. At Corps headquarters, discussions remained focused on immediate tactical concerns. Infantry divisions reported losses and shortages. Requests for fuel and ammunition went unanswered or were delayed. In staff meetings, Allied advances were attributed primarily to numerical superiority and air support. Logistics were mentioned, but as a future concern rather than a present one. Bremer prepared his daily summary accordingly, careful not to draw conclusions unsupported by hard data. Still, he included a brief note: enemy motor transport observed on secondary routes at sustained intervals. Pattern suggests decentralized traffic management. The phrasing was cautious and deliberately understated. No response followed. On 9 August, Bremer was temporarily assigned to accompany a liaison officer closer to the front to assess road conditions firsthand. The assignment was routine and intended to verify reports of congestion affecting German withdrawals. The journey took them through areas recently vacated by Allied units. Wrecked vehicles lined the roadsides, but so did signs of recent orderly movement. Tire tracks layered atop one another, fuel cans discarded in quantity, and improvised signage in English indicating directions to supply points no longer present. At near a small village, Bremer observed another parked American truck, this one partially concealed by trees. It bore no unit markings visible from a distance. A set of chalk markings on the road indicated distances and times, already fading from traffic. The vehicle appeared neither abandoned nor guarded. Its presence suggested a temporary function rather than loss. Bremer noted the location and time, but made no immediate comment. He understood that isolated observations could mislead, yet the repetition troubled him. The trucks were not simply passing through, they seemed to anchor movement, acting as nodes in a shifting network. That evening, back at headquarters, Bremer reviewed earlier German assumptions regarding Allied supply lines. Many were based on static models, fixed depots feeding forward units along predictable corridors. What he was seeing suggested something else, an ability to redirect flow rapidly without waiting for formal infrastructure. He did not yet frame this as a failure of doctrine. Instead, he treated it as an anomaly requiring further observation. In his notes, he wrote, "Enemy transport displays flexibility exceeding projected limits, mechanism unclear." The operational problem was beginning to take shape, though its implications were not yet fully understood. German forces depended on identifying pauses in Allied momentum. Those pauses were expected to occur when supply lines stretched too far. Bremer's growing concern was that such pauses were not appearing where anticipated. Still, there were alternative explanations. Allied units might be overextending themselves, risking future collapse. Reports could be exaggerated. Air superiority might be masking vulnerabilities that would soon emerge. For now, Bremer continued his work as before, refining estimates and waiting for confirmation. The evidence was incomplete, and his role required restraint. He filed his observations within the accepted framework, even as the framework itself began to show strain. The parked truck near the hedgerow remained marked on his map, one symbol among many. At this stage, it represented a question rather than a conclusion, a small, persistent indication that the enemy's capacity for movement might not be bounded by the limits German planners had long relied on. As August progressed, the front continued to shift eastward, and the need for accurate assessments grew more urgent. Bremer prepared to revisit his assumptions, but he had not yet done so formally. The routine of reports and maps continued, even as the operational environment moved steadily beyond them.
By mid-August 1944, the German operational situation in northern France had deteriorated further. The collapse of organized resistance west of the Seine was no longer a matter of speculation, but of record. Units retreating from Normandy arrived fragmented, often without heavy equipment, and with incomplete command structures. Headquarters maps required constant revision, sometimes several times a day, as positions reported in the morning were abandoned by evening. Major Karl-Heinz Bremer's workload increased accordingly. As Allied forces advanced toward the Seine crossings, German command required more frequent estimates of enemy movement capacity. The central question was no longer whether the Allies could advance, but how quickly and how sustainably they could do so without a pause for consolidation. German doctrine still provided a reassuring answer. Rapid advances were believed to consume fuel and transport assets at a rate that would soon exceed Allied capacity. Once beyond the reach of established depots, Allied spearheads were expected to slow, if not halt entirely. This expectation underpinned orders to form delaying lines east of Paris and to prepare defensive positions along river barriers. Bremer was tasked with producing updated assessments on Allied logistical strain. To do so, he compiled reports from multiple sources: rear area security units, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights that managed to operate despite Allied air dominance, and intercepted Allied radio traffic. None of these sources alone offered clarity. Together, they painted a picture that was increasingly difficult to reconcile with established models. Reports continued to emphasize traffic on minor roads. Security battalions, often bypassed and isolated, described continuous movement past their positions. Trucks traveled without apparent congestion, stopping briefly before resuming movement in different directions. The volume was not overwhelming at any single point, but it was persistent across wide areas. Bremer noted that Allied transport did not appear to rely on long convoys. Instead, movement occurred in smaller packets, reducing vulnerability to air attack and easing traffic flow. This method also complicated German attempts to measure throughput. Traditional counting methods assumed concentrated movement. Dispersed traffic blurred those metrics. Loss reports added another layer of concern. German units reported destroying Allied vehicles during ambushes or air attacks, yet follow-up reconnaissance showed little lasting impact on traffic levels. Roads cleared by German demolitions were repaired or bypassed quickly. Temporary bridges appeared where permanent ones had been destroyed. In several cases, Allied vehicles crossed rivers at unexpected points using portable equipment. At Corps headquarters, these developments were discussed but not emphasized. Senior officers attributed Allied resilience to sheer industrial capacity rather than operational method. The distinction mattered. If capacity alone explained Allied movement, shortages would eventually impose limits. If method was the decisive factor, then those limits might be far higher than anticipated. Bremer's analysis increasingly pointed toward the latter. In a memorandum drafted on 12 August, he wrote that Allied logistics appeared less centralized and less dependent on fixed nodes than previously assumed. He stopped short of challenging doctrine directly, framing the observation as provisional. The memorandum received no formal reply. Meanwhile, German withdrawals accelerated. The encirclement at Falaise had already inflicted heavy losses, and surviving units were in no condition to establish strong defensive positions. Orders emphasized speed of movement to avoid encirclement, but German transport shortages made compliance difficult. Fuel rationing was severe. Vehicles were abandoned not for lack of personnel, but for lack of fuel. Bremer could not avoid the contrast. German movements were constrained by scarcity and rigid planning, while Allied movements appeared adaptive and continuous. The disparity was evident in road conditions. German columns halted frequently, waiting for orders or fuel. Allied columns, by contrast, flowed around obstacles. On 14th August, Bremer received a report from an engineer detachment observing Allied activity near Chartres. The report described a temporary supply point established in an open field, marked only by flags and vehicles arranged in a rough grid. Fuel and ammunition were distributed rapidly, and the site was abandoned within hours. No permanent structures were used. This observation was significant. German doctrine emphasized the vulnerability of forward depots and assumed their presence could be detected and targeted. The Allied approach described did not conform to this model. By minimizing permanence, the Allies reduced exposure and increased flexibility. Bremer added the report to his growing file of anomalies. He began to sketch alternative explanations on a separate map, marking not depots but movement patterns. Lines replaced points. Instead of asking where supplies were stored, he asked how they flowed. As the days passed, pressure from higher command intensified. Requests arrived demanding estimates of when Allied forces would be forced to pause for resupply. Bremer's earlier notes were revisited, but he found no evidence supporting a near-term halt. Allied units continued to appear east of expected positions, sometimes with minimal delay. During a staff conference on 16th August, Bremer cautiously raised the issue. He suggested that Allied logistics might be operating under different sets of assumptions than those guiding German planning. The response was restrained but dismissive. One senior officer noted that American forces had not yet encountered a determined defensive line, and that once they did, their supply system would reveal its weaknesses. Bremer did not argue further. His role was advisory, not directive. Still, the exchange underscored the growing gap between observation and expectation. The consequences of this gap became clearer as German attempts to stabilize the front failed. Defensive positions planned on the assumption of Allied pauses were overrun before they were fully established. Units ordered to hold for a set period found themselves facing enemy forces sooner than anticipated. Bremer tracked these failures carefully. In his records, he noted that delays in Allied movement were shorter and less frequent than projected. Where pauses occurred, they were often due to tactical considerations rather than logistical ones. By 14th August, the pattern was unmistakable. Allied logistics did not operate as a fragile extension vulnerable to distance alone. Instead, it functioned as a flexible system capable of sustaining rapid advance over extended terrain. The implications for German planning were severe. Yet doctrine remained unchanged. Orders continued to reference expected supply exhaustion points. Bremer was instructed to refine his estimates rather than revise the underlying assumptions. He complied, adjusting numbers but leaving the framework intact. Privately, he began to question whether refinement was sufficient. The operational problem was no longer a matter of margins, it was structural. German planning depended on constraints that did not appear to apply. As Allied forces approached the Seine, Bremer's maps grew increasingly crowded with erased lines and revised annotations. The parked truck he had first marked days ago was no longer unique. It had become representative of a broader pattern, one that suggested the Allies could reposition not just divisions, but entire operational groupings with speed and coordination previously considered unattainable. The tension between observed reality and official doctrine continued to grow, even as time to address it diminished. Bremer prepared his next report with greater care, aware that his conclusions, if stated plainly, would challenge long-held assumptions at a moment when German command was least inclined to reconsider them.
By the third week of August 1944, the operational environment confronting German headquarters east of Paris had shifted from uncertainty to crisis. The Allied advance no longer followed a predictable axis. Armored formations appeared on routes previously considered unsuitable for sustained movement, while infantry units advanced with support that arrived not days later, but within hours. German planning assumptions, though still formally intact, were increasingly contradicted by events on the ground. Major Karl-Heinz Bremer's responsibilities expanded accordingly. He was now required to brief senior staff officers directly, rather than submitting written summaries alone. These briefings focused on anticipated Allied movement rates, expected supply limitations, and opportunities for delaying action. Each briefing required him to reconcile observed evidence with doctrinal expectations, a task that grew more difficult with each passing day. The immediate operational concern centered on the Seine river crossings. German command believed that even if Allied forces reached the river quickly, their logistics would struggle to sustain crossings and continued advance beyond it. Bridges had been prepared for demolition, and it was assumed that destruction of fixed crossings would impose a natural pause. Bremer's recent observations cast doubt on this assumption. Reports from engineer units indicated Allied preparations for temporary crossings well beyond known bridge sites. Pontoon equipment appeared to be moving with forward elements rather than following behind. This contradicted German estimates that such equipment would be limited and centrally controlled. On 19 August, Bremer reviewed a compiled intelligence packet that included intercepted Allied communications referencing fuel distribution points designated only by grid coordinates and time windows. The absence of fixed names or locations suggested a system designed to avoid permanence. Fuel was being delivered where and when it was needed, then moved again. This evidence marked a turning point in Bremer's analysis. For the first time, he began to treat Allied logistics not as a supporting function constrained by distance, but as an operational instrument in its own right. Movement itself appeared to be the organizing principle. Bremer made an unofficial decision that evening. Rather than continue refining estimates within the existing framework, he began constructing an alternative assessment in parallel. This assessment did not reject doctrine openly, but it set it aside temporarily. He focused instead on what the evidence suggested the Allies could do, rather than what German planning said they should be able to do. Using available reports, Bremer plotted Allied movement not by unit designation, but by flow density. He traced how quickly vehicles appeared on successive road segments, how long temporary supply points remained active, and how often routes shifted. The resulting map bore little resemblance to standard operational charts. It showed a web of movement rather than lines of advance. One pattern stood out clearly. Allied transport did not slow proportionally with distance from the Normandy beaches. Instead, throughput remained relatively stable over long stretches. Where congestion occurred, it was resolved quickly through rerouting rather than waiting. This suggested a level of coordination and autonomy at lower command levels that German doctrine did not account for. Bremer compared this with German capabilities. German logistics remained centralized, fuel allocation tightly controlled, and movement permissions layered through command channels. Flexibility was limited by regulation as much as by scarcity. The contrast was stark. The personal risk in Bremer's analysis lay not in the conclusions themselves, but in how they might be received. Questioning doctrine at this stage of the war carried professional and political consequences. Staff officers were expected to support command decisions, not undermine them with alternative models. Nevertheless, Bremer believed that withholding his revised assessment would be more damaging. If German command continued to expect logistical pauses that did not occur, defensive planning would remain misaligned with reality. Units would be ordered to hold positions they could not prepare in time. On 21 August, Bremer requested a brief slot during a corps-level planning session. His request was granted, though with limited time allocated. When his turn came, he presented his findings carefully. He avoided doctrinal language and focused on observed patterns. He stated that Allied logistics appeared capable of sustaining rapid movement across multiple axes simultaneously. He noted that destruction of fixed infrastructure had not produced the expected delays. He emphasized that Allied transport operated in a dispersed, time-based system rather than relying on static depots. The response was mixed. Some officers listened attentively, asking clarifying questions about sources and reliability. Others remained skeptical, pointing out that Allied forces would eventually encounter limits, particularly as they approached Germany's borders. One senior officer remarked that American efficiency was often overstated and that enthusiasm would outpace endurance. Bremer did not press the point further. He concluded by stating that his assessment was provisional and subject to revision as more data became available. Formally, the briefing ended without decision or directive. Informally, however, Bremer sensed that he had crossed a boundary. He had presented an interpretation that diverged from established expectations at a moment when command cohesion was under strain. The risk was not immediate reprimand, but quiet marginalization. His analyses might simply be set aside. In the days that followed, events continued to support his assessment. Allied forces crossed the Seine more quickly than anticipated, using a combination of repaired bridges and temporary crossings. Supply disruptions were minimal. German attempts to regroup east of the river were compromised by the speed of the advance. Bremer updated his alternative map accordingly. It now extended beyond the Seine, showing continued movement towards Belgium. The scale of Allied mobility suggested that the operational depth German planners had counted on no longer existed. At the same time, Bremer became aware of increased scrutiny. Requests for his reports were routed through additional channels. His briefings were shortened. He was asked to focus on immediate tactical estimates rather than broader patterns. These adjustments were subtle but unmistakable. Despite this, Bremer continued his parallel analysis quietly. He believed that even if his conclusions were not acted upon immediately, they would remain relevant. The evidence was accumulating too consistently to ignore indefinitely. The parked American truck that had first drawn his attention weeks earlier now seemed emblematic of a larger truth. Allied logistics did not depend on visible concentration. It relied on movement itself, temporary, adaptable, and difficult to disrupt. As August drew to a close, Bremer faced a professional dilemma. To persist in advancing his assessment risked isolation. To abandon it risked contributing to further operational misjudgments. For the moment, he chose a cautious middle path, maintaining his analysis while limiting how forcefully he presented it. The war's momentum, however, did not allow for prolonged ambiguity. Each day brought new evidence, and each failed German estimate carried tangible consequences at the front. The tension between observation and authority no longer was abstract. It had become operational. By early September 1944, the consequences of earlier planning assumptions were evident across the German defensive effort in Western Europe. The rapid Allied advance through France had not slowed at the expected points. Instead, it pressed forward into Belgium and toward the German border with a momentum that strained German command structures and exposed systemic weaknesses. Major Karl-Heinz Bremer now worked from a series of improvised headquarters, each occupied for shorter periods than the last. Communications were unreliable. Staff cohesion suffered as officers were reassigned, captured, or killed. In this environment, Bremer's role narrowed further, officially confined to immediate movement estimates rather than broader logistical analysis. Despite these constraints, Bremer continued to observe the same patterns. Allied logistics remained resilient. Fuel shortages predicted by German planners did not materialize in decisive form. Where Allied units paused, it was often due to tactical regrouping or command coordination, not lack of supply. The expected operational exhaustion points remained elusive. German attempts to counter this mobility faced mounting difficulties. Air interdiction, once relied upon to disrupt supply lines, proved insufficient against dispersed traffic. Road demolitions delayed movement briefly, but alternative routes were used with minimal loss of tempo. Efforts to target rear area logistics lacked focus because there were few fixed targets to strike. Bremer documented these failures meticulously. In his internal notes, he listed instances where German actions produced less delay than anticipated. He avoided attributing blame, instead emphasizing mismatches between planning assumptions and observed outcomes. These notes, however, remained unofficial and were not circulated widely. Pushback from authority became more pronounced. Bremer was instructed explicitly to align his estimates with existing operational directives. When he submitted figures suggesting that Allied forces could continue advancing without significant pause, they were revised upward by superiors to reflect expected constraints. The adjustments were justified as necessary for consistency. During one staff discussion, a senior officer reminded those present that German doctrine had proven effective in earlier phases of the war, and that current setbacks were the result of unfavorable circumstances rather than conceptual flaws. The implication was clear. Deviation from established thinking was neither welcome nor useful. Bremer responded by narrowing his formal contributions further. He focused on providing precise, localized estimates that could not easily be dismissed, while reserving his broader conclusions for private records. This approach reduced friction, but also limited the influence of his analysis. The stakes, however, continued to rise. German units ordered to hold delaying positions based on optimistic timelines were repeatedly overrun. Withdrawal orders arrived late, and coordination between formations broke down. Each failure reinforced the pattern Bremer had identified weeks earlier. One episode in particular underscored the cost of misjudgment. A planned defensive line along a minor river was expected to hold for 48 hours, providing time to reposition reserves. Allied forces crossed within 12. Bremer's earlier estimate had suggested such an outcome was likely, but it had been discounted as overly pessimistic. In the aftermath, Bremer noted increased caution among some staff officers. Quietly, questions were raised about Allied supply methods, yet no formal reassessment occurred. The system, under pressure, defaulted to familiar explanations rather than confronting uncomfortable evidence. Bremer's position remained precarious. He was neither reprimanded nor endorsed. His work continued, but its impact was muted. The tension between what he observed and what he was permitted to report persisted. As Allied forces approached Germany's western borders, the implications of sustained mobility became unavoidable. Defensive depth had been eroded faster than planned. Opportunities to stabilize the front were missed because they were anticipated at points the enemy bypassed or reached too quickly. Bremer continued to mark his maps, though their purpose had shifted. They no longer guided planning so much as recorded a sequence of missed expectations. The web of Allied movement he had drawn earlier now extended deep into regions once considered secure. By mid-September, the question was no longer whether Allied logistics defied German assumptions, but whether German command could adapt in time. Bremer understood that adaptation would require more than revised numbers. It would require a conceptual shift that the current system seemed unable to make under pressure. For the moment, he remained at his desk, performing his assigned duties while maintaining his private assessment. The war moved forward regardless of internal debates. The costs of earlier decisions continued to accumulate, and the space for correction narrowed with each passing day.
By late September 1944, the Western Front had reached Germany's western approaches. The speed of the Allied advance through France and Belgium was now a matter of record rather than debate. German command no longer spoke openly of anticipated pauses based on fuel exhaustion or transport limits. Instead, planning focused on immediate defensive crises and the allocation of increasingly scarce resources. Major Karl-Heinz Bremer remained in service, though his role had diminished further. His assignments were now narrowly defined, often limited to compiling short-term movement estimates for specific sectors. The broader logistical analyses he had developed earlier were no longer requested. They existed only in his private notes and in fragments embedded within routine reports. The institutional response to the logistical reality Bremer had identified was quiet and indirect. No formal acknowledgement of doctrinal failure was issued. No revised manuals were distributed. Instead, German command adapted incrementally where possible, relying more on ad hoc measures than on systematic reform. By this stage of the war, the capacity for comprehensive adjustment was limited. Allied logistics, meanwhile, did encounter strains as operations extended toward Germany. Fuel shortages did appear in late autumn, particularly during the rapid advance of certain armored units.
However, these shortages occurred far deeper into Europe than German planners had anticipated months earlier. The delay Bremer had warned would not come had indeed failed to materialize at the expected time and place. Bremer observed these developments with a sense of professional confirmation rather than satisfaction. His earlier assessments had not altered the course of events, but they had aligned with them. The Allies' ability to sustain movement through decentralized, flexible logistics had proven decisive in shaping the tempo of operations. As the front stabilized temporarily along the German border, Bremer's notes became more reflective. He reviewed his earliest observations, the parked truck on a minor road, the temporary fuel points, the dispersed traffic patterns. What had seemed anomalous at first had revealed an entire operational philosophy, logistics not as a static backbone, but as a mobile, adaptive system. Within German records, Bremer's contributions left little trace. Staff officers rarely signed their work, and analyses that contradicted prevailing assumptions were seldom preserved. After the war, surviving documents focused on tactical engagements and command decisions rather than logistical interpretation. Bremer's private notes did not enter official archives. His career after 1944 followed an unremarkable path. Like many staff officers, he survived the war without distinction or public recognition. He was neither promoted for insight nor penalized for dissent. His experience remained an example of how institutional systems absorb or sideline uncomfortable observations rather than confront them directly. From a historical perspective, the significance of Bremer's experience lies not in a single decision or action, but in the pattern it illustrates. The German army did not lack capable analysts. It lacked the flexibility to revise foundational assumptions under pressure. Evidence accumulated, but doctrine persisted. The Allied logistical system Bremer observed would later be studied extensively by military planners. Concepts such as decentralized supply, flexible routing, and time-based distribution became standard features of post-war doctrine. In that sense, the phenomenon Bremer recognized in real time would eventually be formalized, though too late to matter for the German war effort. Bremer himself did not frame his observations as revolutionary. He did not claim to have discovered a new principle of warfare. He simply recorded what he saw and measured its implications against the expectations he had been taught. The gap between the two was the story. The parked truck that had first caught his attention was not remarkable on its own. It carried no markings of importance. Yet it represented a system in motion, one capable of moving not just supplies, but entire armies with speed and resilience. That system did not rely on spectacle. It relied on routine. In the end, Bremer's experience underscores a quiet truth of military history. Wars are often decided not by dramatic breakthroughs alone, but by the ability to adapt organizational thinking to observable reality. Where adaptation fails, even accurate observation can have limited effect. His legacy, if it can be called that, is found in hindsight rather than in contemporary recognition. It resides in the lesson that understanding an enemy's capacity requires more than counting resources. It requires recognizing how those resources are organized, moved, and employed. For those who study the Second World War today, Bremer's story offers a reminder that behind major events stand individuals tasked with noticing patterns, often without the authority to act upon them. Their insights may not change outcomes, but they help explain them. If you value careful, historically grounded examinations of overlooked perspectives from World War II, consider subscribing to the channel.